right, good evening. Molo, Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Good evening, good evening, good evening. Welcome to another episode of the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Now, it's a Monday evening. You're probably wondering, heck, Sikhle, why are you on our screens? We thought the BDL show was every Wednesday. Well, ordinarily, that is the case. However, there are going to be a few changes that we're ringing in on the show generally, interimly right now, and of course into the future as we're looking to relaunch the show. Guys, interesting new content coming your way. So with that being said, I just decided, fudge it. Why not in the first 2 weeks of being back, be on your screens every evening and pilot some of these conversations that I'll be having with key figures this week. So over the next 2 weeks, let me begin here. In this week, expect to see the faces of heads of organizations that I'll be working with directly or indirectly, guys who basically form that broad coalition of liberty-minded organizations and people, whether they are conservatives, liberals, classical liberals, or even anarchists, but basically those organizations who I will be working with directly or indirectly. So expect to see the Institute of Race Relations, as we'll have a conversation with them tonight, Afri Forum, Solidarity, Dear SA, and indeed the Free Market Foundation. We're going to have a conversation this week with heads of those organizations. What are their plans for 2023 to advance liberty, free market economy, free trade, and indeed the sort of society that I like to describe broadly as a faith, flag, family, and freedom type society? How do we make sure that that society lives in a, as I said, a free society, prosperous one with property rights, defined by property rights, and of course, non-racialism? These are the values. These are the ideas that we're fighting for. So with that being said, enough with the jibber jabber. A quick reminder from me that if you love the content on the show, how about you do me a favor? Hit that like button, whether you're watching this simulcast on Facebook or on YouTube. Speaking about YouTube, easy peasy. Subscribe to the show so that you never miss any of the content here on the Big Daddy Liberty channel. And speaking about BDL, we have a website, a very fun one. Find us at bigdaddyliberty.com. There, of course, you can also pledge some support to the show. Find a payment method that suits you, and people really are putting aside between 50 to 100 Rand a month to support this channel. Trust me, it'll be needed as we head into a year where I'm hitting the road again, advocating for liberty ideas. Whoa, that was a mouthful. All right, Sikhle, enough with the jibber jabber, enough with the waffle. How about we introduce our guest for this evening? He is, of course, the head honcho over at the Institute of Race Relations. I'm talking, of course, about John Endres. Let me bring him on screen. There he is. Brother John, Happy New Year, Baba, and welcome to the show.
Happy New Year to you, and thank you very much for having me on. Hello, Sikhle.
Absolutely. It is absolutely fantastic to have you guys on. I think anybody who's a fan of the show, anybody who's been watching for a while, knows that the opening credits, for instance, mention that I'm in partnership with the Institute of Race Relations for good reason, because you guys are one of the few premier, classically liberal organizations that is people who fight and advance the ideas of liberty in South Africa. But John, there might be someone who doesn't even know what the Institute of Race Relations is. Briefly, what are you guys? Who are you guys? What do you stand for?
Well, we've been around for a really long time, Sikhle. So the Institute of Race Relations was actually founded in 1929 by a group of people who were concerned about the direction in which South Africa was heading. At the time, of course, their main concern would have been race relations. That's why they called it the Institute of Race Relations. And what they did over time was that they collected a lot of information and data to track and see what was going on in terms of race relations in South Africa. So they would have employment data and wage data, income data and education data, etc., etc. They would write papers about what was going on in the country. And what they were trying to do was move the country towards a non-racial future, which of course at the time seemed like a pipe dream, but ultimately came to fruition in many ways, which we are of course very grateful for and happy about. But we do feel that there is still some remaining way that needs to be traversed on the way towards more freedom and proper non-racialism in South Africa. And that is what the Institute of Race Relations is dedicated to today.
Absolutely. And I think anybody listening to that, John, will know exactly why they're for. the Big Daddy Liberty brand and channel is very closely in partnership with you guys. And I'm very grateful for that partnership. Let's speak perhaps about some of the work, John, that we've been prosecuting, let's say over 2022. What's been the big concerns, perhaps, that the IRR is grappling with at the moment? What was the big issues in 2022? And even as you say that, we're going to unpack some of those issues as we look at maybe the current state of things and into 2023. But let's take a step back. 2022, John, what are we busy fighting against at the moment? Or rather, particularly, what ideas are we trying to advance in society, given the issues that we face?
Well, you mentioned the word idea, sorry, there we go. And of course, that is really what it's about. So from the IRR's point of view, societies are defined on the one hand by the policies that governments introduce, for example, by the decisions that people make. And both those decisions and the policies are informed by ideas ultimately. What do people think about what a society should look like, how an economy should be run, how people should interact with each other? That's all determined by ideas. So if you want to change the way that a country works, and ideally change it for the better, you need to work on the ideas that underlie the decisions and the policies within a country. And so the IRR's work is very much focused in the ideas space. It is about getting the ideas of free markets, individual liberty, individual rights, property rights into broad acceptance. And how we do that is by communicating at great length and very intensively about these ideas, how they work, and why they should be adopted as broadly as possible. So speaking about 2022, last year, we saw that there were quite a few concerning developments in the policy space, several of the most concerning of which were around the idea of property rights. So the battle around expropriation without compensation has been running for many years now. It was identified by our senior colleague at the Institute, Anthea Jeffrey, as long ago as 2008, 2007, 2008, at which time it was dismissed as being a crazy idea, and it was simply not something to be worried about. But of course, as events have shown, it is very much a cause of concern. The ANC in 2017 decided that expropriation without compensation should be enabled in South Africa, either through a constitutional amendment or through an ordinary law process. The constitutional amendment was defeated, fortunately, at the end of 2021, but that still left the second avenue open for the ANC to pursue expropriation without compensation, which they are still doing right to this day, through a law called the Expropriation Bill, which, if passed, will allow the government to expropriate land without compensation, subject to a certain number of circumstances, which is not a limited list. In other words, those circumstances can be expanded ad libitum as required. And that fills us with great concern. That bill has been passed by the National Assembly, that is the lower house of Parliament already. It now needs to go through the National Council of Provinces and be signed by the President in order to become law. And this is one of the main areas of activity of the Institute, is to fight against that and to push back against it as strongly as we possibly can.
Sorry, John, I was just about to say, I want us to unpack this a little bit more, because I think it's absolutely fundamental. And perhaps people don't understand why, the crazy libertarian or classical liberal that is Big Daddy Liberty rails on about the issue of property rights, and how when we talk about property, John, it isn't just land. Most people think, oh, why worry about this issue? It's just land. They're only going to take from those whites anyway. We can totally trust politicians. These are the sort of arguments we hear in the country, given how racialized our chattering class is. But here's the cold hard facts. In truth of the matter, once you give politicians the power to confiscate something from you, and when we say property, we don't just mean land, as I said. It can be the very cell phone I record this on, or the money in your wallet, John. But effectively, once we give politicians the power to expropriate without compensation or confiscate without having to compensate you something, it's a power that ever expands and eventually stops targeting the people you wanted to target, if you're that sort of racist, who thinks we should be taking land from whites, but actually can come around and take stuff from you too.
Yeah, so the expropriation bill does actually focus specifically on land, but I think you correctly identify that the ANC does have this inclination to messing with other people's property, and that was expressed already in the Water Act, which nationalized effectively all water in South Africa. The Mineral Resources and Petroleum Development Act did the same thing in the mineral resources sector, where the mineral resources that previously was a private property right that people held was passed into the custodianship of the state, which was not declared an expropriation, but in effect amounted to much the same thing because people lost control of their property. And the same idea underlies what is being done in terms of property rights. And as you rightly point out, this is not an effect that's going to be limited to a certain group, be it farmers out in the rural area. And, if you're living in the city, you don't have to worry about it, or the whites, or this group or that group. It will affect everybody in South Africa if it comes to pass. And one of the reasons for that is that the banks hold a very large amount of property as collateral for loans from farmers, but also from people in urban areas. And as soon as one of those pieces of property gets expropriated by the state without compensation, the value of all the other collateral held by the banks immediately drops. Because imagine going to your bank, after this has happened and saying, look, I've got a piece of land. I want to borrow some money so I can run a farming business, put some investment into my farm. The bank is going to say, well, we don't actually know if you'll still have that land 5 years from now. So if you stop paying your loan, how will we get our money back? So this is one of the really big risks in this expropriation debate, is the risk to the credit cycle. And that is something that the Banking Association, I think, has also pointed out last year or the year before. And that is a major concern. I'd like to add another thing there, Sihle, which is just this idea of the link between property rights and human rights. If your property is not yours to control and to own, but can be taken from you at the stroke of a pen by the government, then you are in a very weak position in your relationship with the government. And that is the real risk. Imagine that you're standing on your property in your house, you have freedom of speech. You can say what you want to say, what you need to say. But if expropriation without compensation is possible, you might think twice about what sort of utterances you're going to make, even being within your own house or on your own property, because you know that the government might say, look, we don't have any laws banning free speech, but we see that this Sihle is saying some really dodgy things, and we think that his farm, his house, his property should really become the target of expropriation. We'll communicate this to him. He may then reconsider whether he wouldn't want to temper his language a little bit or moderate his views. And already you're messing with those really basic fundamental civic values, such as freedom of speech. So property rights are essential. You cannot really overstate their importance. They're hugely, hugely important, and they have to be defended.
Absolutely. And indeed, the record of history is absolutely crystal clear when it comes to this, how this is a battle of ideas, broadly speaking, John. Wherever there are those in power who hold the idea that what belongs to the individual shouldn't belong to the individual, but should belong to them as the state, of course, in the name of doing it for the people, which is always the argument that these sort of people advance when they push their bad ideas. But whenever we give ground to the idea that something that belongs to me, or really, John, I talk a lot about the individual, I talk a lot about me, but really we're a family society. And insofar as I talk about individual rights and the individual, I'm often referring to families. And often it is those in power who are anti the family, anti the individual, as they seek to strip power and resources and ownership and rights from the individual to give it to themselves. I'm using this as a segue, John, to that second point, perhaps, of course, you guys have been fighting the issue of property rights, or rather advancing the issue that we should have property rights, secure and transferable property rights. But there's a bigger issue at the hand of what's behind this, in a sense. And that's that ideological difference between those of us who are on the side of liberty and perhaps those who are in the chattering classes and really in the echelons of power, which is who owns things? Who's in control of things? Is it the individual and society and families, or is it the politician? Where governments become larger and larger, advance more and more laws that give themselves powers at the expense of the individual. What's the work of the IR in this particular regard?
I think it's important to understand the motivation of our ideological opponents, and give credit to the fact that as much as we may accuse them of opportunism and the desire to acquire power and wealth through the misapplication of laws, and I'm sure that is true in part, there is also a moral justification for their policies and their attitudes and their ideas. And that is the idea of equality. So the idea is that as long as people in a country persist or subsist at different levels of wealth, there's something wrong with that society. And a greater degree of equality needs to be brought about. And the way to do that is to remove some resources from the people holding wealth, for the sake of argument, and reallocating that to people who hold less wealth. And the only way that can be done is through a certain level of state coercion. The state needs the ability to take things from people, even if it is against their will, and give it to other people. And that is sort of the moral justification that underlies it. The problem is that the outcomes that this produces are really, really bad for both the people that lose their property, but also for those that gain their property. And the reason for that is that if your property isn't secure, you don't have a motivation to strive to increase your property by offering value to other people in the context of a free market society. Instead, you're not going to work quite as hard. You're not going to try to get ahead by offering value to other people, but you're trying to get into bed with the government, with the agencies of power, in order to improve your own status in life. And that is the great risk. That is why we as liberals, as classical liberals, are so wary of state power and of the power of coercion, because we think that really leads to bad outcomes. If you look at what's happened across the world, across history, usually that leads to higher power concentrations and wealth concentrations and less freedom for individuals.
That's
right. The opposite approach is much better. More freedom for the individual usually leads to better outcomes for individuals across the board, even if there is more inequality as a result.
Absolutely. And this is in effect the ideas that we're therefore trying to push into society. Let me cite a few examples, but before I do that, welcome to it. This is the Big Daddy Liberty Show. My name is Vasikle Gobese. I'm in conversation this whole week with the heads of organizations that I am working with or will want to be working with directly or indirectly. Tonight, we kick it off with the Institute of Race Relations and in conversation with John Endres, who of course is the CEO, the head honcho over at the IRR. Welcome to it. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. John, I think that key difference between us who advocate for more freedom, advocate for giving more power and resources, and indeed liberty to the individual families, versus our opponents who, regardless of their intentions, well-meaning or otherwise, see themselves as actually necessitating putting more power and resources into the hands of the state, into a small vanguard, if I can quote someone like Marx in that regard, that then decides things on behalf of everybody else. That's the key difference here. A society where it's either freedom or a society where a small group pick winners and losers in society. These are the policies that we're fighting, John, to an extent. Those policies that see a small group pick winners and losers in society. In South Africa, unfortunately, that works its way through the prism of race, such as race-based legislation like affirmative action or BEE, for example. Now, often people accuse me of, oh, you love whites, that's why you hate BEE and yada, yada, yada. And I have to explain to people that it has nothing to do with loving whites or hating blacks or loving blacks or hating whites. It's about what kind of society do we want to live in? A free society where opportunity is open to all, or a closed crony society where some decide things on the basis of race and pretend as if that's not the same as what the apartheid politicians were doing. John?
Yeah, I think, these, as you conduct your conversations this week, I think you're going to find a very large spectrum of views, ranging from a much greater level of allergy and hostility towards coercion than even the IRR would present. We consider ourselves to be quite moderate in that sense. But I think ultimately the point is that if you look at society as a broader collection of people, of families, of entities, all interacting with each other, freedom is scary, is something somebody once said to me. I think that's quite true, because what you ultimately want to do is give people quite a lot of autonomy and freedom to make their own decisions in their own lives. And if you're a well-meaning person, you're going to worry that people are going to make bad decisions, wrong decisions, decisions that are bad for other people, etc., etc. So you must intervene. But the more you intervene, often the worse the outcomes that you get are, and often the more freedom you allow for people to interact with each other voluntarily on a non-violent basis, very importantly, the better the outcomes are. And the underlying idea here is that freedom of exchange enables people to trade and interact with each other only on a voluntary basis, and that means they will only do it if there's a benefit for both sides. In other words, when people say, for example, free trade or capitalism is to be equated with colonialism, that's quite a severe misunderstanding of how this is meant to work. Because in colonialism, precisely, it was not a free exchange, it was not a free trade. In other words, the colonizer would come in and impose their rules and take what they wanted, and sell what they wanted to sell. But this was not a relationship of two parties equally contributing and freely exchanging what they wanted to exchange. When you have the free exchange, it means that both sides want to do it. And that means that there's a value in it for both sides. And the more of those interactions you've got in a society, the more value you create collectively for the entire society, and you build up over time, and you get to a much better point. You get to a wealthy society, like the societies that South Africa should aspire to, the wealthy societies in the world.
Even as you say this, I have to bring us back, unfortunately, to the status quo, what South Africa really then is, and perhaps the bad ideas that are pervasive in the country and that organizations like yours and, of course, this channel are trying to combat, to counter. John, we're in 2023. There are big issues that we need to sort of chew on, big topics that we need to push back on or offer a different ideas. Sorry, I'm trapped by my own sentence construction here because I'm trying to say two things at once. Let's do the first. John, right now we're in a situation where the bad ideas are very pervasive, are being driven by not only the politicians in this country, but also really a very influential and loud social elite, political and social elite in this country, who have preferential access to, mainstream media and the like. So it boils down to this idea of the battle of ideas. Let me zoom in on the IRR. What is the focus of the Institute of Race Relations for 2023? What are the big issues that you guys will be chewing on as you seek to advance these ideas of liberty, free markets, and really a non-racial society?
Well, as dire as the state of the country is that we find, the point that we find ourselves at the moment is, I think it also offers an opportunity. And the reason I say that is that the outcomes produced by the current policies and ideas are so dismal that they are really indefensible. And that is precisely what opens up the space for other people to come in and say, look, what we've been doing so far clearly isn't working. It really is time to try something new. And it probably has to be new from quite a fundamental way. It's not a question of redesigning BEE to make it more effective or to improve preferential procurement, to make it more representative. That's not going to work. It needs a completely new approach. And to make it really concrete, at the moment, what most South Africans, I think, are terribly worried about is load shedding at the state of ESKOM. We're at stage 6 load shedding at the moment. It means 8 hours without power per day. And you've just frozen, Sichle. Okay, I see you back. 8 hours without power per day, up to 10 hours. That is a serious emergency. That's a real problem. And it's across the entire economy. Small businesses having to lose half of their trading day is a problem. Small businesses having to invest in backup power and not having the means to do so is a huge problem. Farming enterprises in a country where 90% of the vegetable crop is farmed under irrigation, which depends on power for the pumps, losing half a day's production is a huge issue. So I really think that things are coming to a head now, and there's a real risk to the country under stage 6 load shedding or even worse. That is a huge concern. But again, it opens up this opportunity for organizations like the IRR and others that we will be speaking to explain what created the problem and what needs to change in order to get rid of the problem. And I'll just mention 3 quick points from the IRR, which are the following. If you want to fix ESKOM and load shedding, there are 3 things you have to do. You need 3 non-negotiable requirements. The first is that ESKOM needs to have autonomy and freedom in hiring decisions. You cannot have ESKOM restricted by transformation needs, representativity, cadre deployment, getting connected cronies into jobs, not being able to fire people who aren't performing. You can't afford to do that. ESKOM needs to have that autonomy. It needs to be able to decide who it wants to bring on board, who's got the skills that are required. It needs to be able to decide who to let go if they're not adding value. It needs that freedom. Secondly, ESKOM needs freedom in procurement. At the moment, ESKOM is constrained by a preferential procurement, so there has to be representativity and transformation in procurement. It is constrained by local content requirements, by localization, by master plans, etc., etc. And all of this is pushing costs up, and it is making it impossible for ESKOM to work effectively. ESKOM needs freedom in procurement. It needs to be able to make its purchases on a value for money basis from whatever supplier is able to supply at the right price, at the right quality, and with the right service level attached to that. The third requirement is law enforcement. ESKOM, as we know, is under siege. It is beset by criminal elements throughout the supply chain, from the coal trucks to the power stations themselves, all the way, if you want to go to the municipalities, with non-payment of electricity to ESKOM, electricity fees to ESKOM, or by residents to the municipality. All of this is a form of theft. And as long as you got this much, this amount of resources being deviated from productive uses, ESKOM cannot be fixed. So those three things need to be in place. You need autonomy in personnel, autonomy in procurement, and you need law enforcement. And then you've got a chance. Each of these three things runs directly counter to stated ANC policy, which is why I think it cannot, that's why I think ESKOM cannot be fixed while the ANC is in power, because ESKOM cannot be given freedom in its hiring and firing decisions. It cannot be given freedom in procurement, and law enforcement is not allowed to become effective when it comes to ESKOM. As long as those three requirements aren't met, I don't see that there's a way out. Conversely, the outcomes are now so bad that I think it will weaken the ANC further. It's a real risk to the ruling party, and they face increasingly severe loss of support in the electorate. And that ultimately opens up the door to somebody else taking over and fulfilling these three requirements, and adding to that privatization, improving the energy mix, freeing up the transmission grid for wheeling electricity through it. All these other things that need to happen can then happen. But that has to happen before ESKOM can be fixed.
I mean, to this particular point, this morning on Vuganazo, we actually spoke about this, where I said the electricity issue and load shedding in particular, and the decline in the transmission, and really I don't know how to phrase this, the decline effectively in what people took for granted for a very long time as electricity, is seeing an unrest develop at the moment that I don't think the ANC will be able to contain, both as a government and politically, as a political party. Phoenix, for example, erupted into very violent service delivery protests, or protests against load shedding, just this past weekend. And indeed, Kroonstad, I haven't reported on this yet, but it also is seeing civil unrest as people are fed up with the issue of load shedding. And I warned that this would just be the beginning of this particular issue. John, I don't want to bog us down too much on load shedding, because really I wanted to get a sense of what are the big issues also outside of load shedding that the IRR will be focusing on 2023. I do believe load shedding is a very massive one, especially because it speaks to that idea of allowing the market to do more things, and removing bad policy bad policy rather that constrains organizations such as BEE and affirmative action. But some of the other issues the IR will be tackling in 2023.
I think that, two of the really big other topics that we'll be dealing with, on the one hand, are property rights. Expropriation bill, we've spoken about a little bit already. But the thing is that the expropriation bill doesn't stand in isolation. There's another piece of law called the Land Court Bill, which will, you could effectively call it the expropriation court bill, which is another law that will support expropriation. And that is something that we're monitoring, that we are acting on, and that we are trying to combat as well. There's also the Prevention of Illegal Evictions Act, and also the Illegal Entry on Premises Act, the old Trespassers Act in its new version. Those laws are the Illegal Entrance on Premises Bill is in the process of being passed. That's got some concerning provisions that we are also combating. So let's call it property rights as one of our big focus areas. The second big focus area is going to be race in hiring and in procurement. So we know we've got the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, currently also in the process of being passed into law. I think that is on the president's desk already, ready for signature, if I'm not mistaken. And that will give the Labour Minister quite extensive powers over private companies allowing him to set race targets for companies of different sizes, of different sectors, in different geographical areas. And that is a disaster waiting to happen. So that is also very much on our minds. And the same is, of course, the case in terms of preferential procurement, where at the moment, many government entities, when they buy goods and services from the market, are forced to include racial criteria in that. That is in a state of flux at the moment, with some regulations having been passed, having been found unconstitutional, having been withdrawn. But now the government, or as the ANC, is pushing towards the adoption of a new Preferential Procurement Act, which will, when passed, I think, clarify that race is very much a part of procurement in the public sector. And that, of course, is a problem. Imagine that you have, a municipality, and you've got the choice of building a road, for example, tarring a road into the village. If you do it on a value for money basis, you might be able to do 10 kilometers of road at the budget that you've got available. But if you do it on a preferential procurement basis, you might only be able to do 2 kilometers. And you'll say, well, at least, it's a black company that is doing the 2 kilometers, and that's great. They're becoming empowered. But the villagers are the ones who are left stuck without a road. And that is why value for money is so important in public procurement, and why we're pushing for it. We're saying that has to be your primary focus. Chief Justice Zondo, as presiding officer of the Zondo Commission, wrote in his report that there was a tension in the Constitution between this need for value for money on the one hand and for redress and transformation on the other hand. He said, you can't actually put these at the same level, because then you get conflicts of interest and conflicts of decision making, and you get discretion coming into it. You get this big mess of corruption that the entire Zondo Commission was about. You have to prioritize, you have to choose. Either do you want to transform, is that your main objective? Or do you want value for money, is that your main objective? You've got to pick one. And he said it's got to be value for money. That's what it's
Absolutely. Got to be. And I must say this, even as I listen to these key priority areas that you guys will be looking into, that we'll be writing on, advancing alternative policy on, and of course, challenging bad ideas and bad policy on, you can't do this alone. How do we support the Institute of Race Relations? How do we go about doing that?
Well, the easiest way, I think, is to read what we write, and you'll find us in the media, so all the mainstream media publications, we write there, but also our own outlet called The Daily Friend. So if you're not already a subscriber to The Daily Friend, or a visitor or a reader, go and check it out, and I think you'll see lots of content that you'll find quite valuable. We are more than half crowd-funded, and we appreciate very much the members of the public that are able to send us some money every month in support of our battle of ideas, and that subscribe to the ideas of liberty and free markets and non-racialism. So anybody who is able to, in a position to, we would appreciate it very much if you would lend your support. And you'll find the details on the website at irr.org.za.
Absolutely. And maybe on that glorious note, we have completely run out of time. John, I'm going to give you the last word, though, on this particular issue. I was a little clickbaity, as I said, in the intro, or rather in the heading of this video, but there is something to be said on this, and I want you to have the final word on it. It's the year 2023. People are very worried about the state of the country and the economy. Is this the collapse of South Africa, John? Should we despair?
I think it's too early to call the collapse of South Africa, but I think it's not too early to be worried about the collapse of South Africa being incoming. And I think the collapse of South Africa is very closely tied to ANC governance. That's becoming more apparent by the day. And that is where the seed of hope rests, which is that everything that's going on at the moment, I think, is weakening the ANC. And it opens up the opportunity for something new to come out of it. But again, you were asking, what can people do? Focus on this. Make sure that you register to vote, you go to vote in 2024, and you make sure that you know what you're getting, depending on who you vote for. Make a sensible choice. Go and vote. Speak to your neighbors, your friends. Get people out. Get them engaged. Next year is going to be a really important election.
Absolutely. That, ladies and gentlemen, is John Endres, who, of course, is the CEO of the Institute of Race Relations. Major thanks to them, and looking forward to working with you guys in another new year. Guys, that's John. As I said, this whole week, I'll be bringing in these individuals, guys who I really find inspiring, to be honest, and who head up these organizations, which, as I said, I'll be working directly or indirectly with. The Institute of Race Relations is one of those organizations that I work very, very directly with, and I encourage you to support them. Make sure, please, you head over to their website at www.irr.org.za. Become a friend of the IRR and pledge some support every month. It could be $100 or $150 every month. These funds, trust me, go into a coterie and a group of people who are advancing those liberty ideas, pushing back against bad ideas in society. I'm very happy to be associated with these fellas, and long may this partnership continue. Now, with that being said, enough of this jibber jabber. Let me say good night to you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you tomorrow evening as I'm in conversation with another such organization who I am looking to work with, especially on the issue of how do we build self-reliance in South African society? How do we bolster our communities to be able to stand against the bad headwinds that are coming our way? I'm talking, of course, about solidarity, or solidariteit, as we say in Afrikaans. And ek sal gesels met Dirk Human, who, of course, is the CEO, or pardon me, one of the head honchos at the trade union. So look forward to that tomorrow night, 7:30 here on the Big Daddy Liberty channel. With that being said, thank you for watching. Hit that like button on your way out, subscribe on YouTube, and yeah, guys, please visit our website at bigdaddyliberty.com. Right, with that being said, thank you for watching, and as I always say at the end of every show, never trust a commie.